Welcome to the Ethical Pitfalls in AI webinar. I welcome Danny Saksenberg, Chief AI Officer of Emerge. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Yolan, and welcome to everyone here. It's really great to have you in what I hope will be the first of many webinars given on behalf of the EDM dealing with topics relating to AI. And today I'm very, very fortunate to be joined by Diana Ascher. I'll let Diana introduce herself in a second, but you're going to see that Diana is really just incomparable in this particular area. And so we're really very fortunate to hear from her. And we thought it would be a great idea to discuss this topic just because it's so topical. AI is exploding everywhere, and there have been quite a few demonstrations of how not to do the ethics of AI over the last couple of years. So we thought it would be a good idea to talk about this. Just by way of introduction and what we plan to cover today. So I'll be doing these introductions in a second. And what we want to talk about is the business case for ethical AI and why being ethically correct is more than just about a warm and fuzzy feeling and being a good upstanding citizen, but there's actually a real business case to getting AI ethics right. We're going to be talking a lot about the accountability, values, and trust that are necessary when working with AI. We're going to discuss some of the common pitfalls and then discuss some of the best practices on how to address them. In terms of who we are, I'm going to hand over to Diana because she can very much speak for herself and does a great job of that.
Thank you, Danny. My name is Diana Ascher. I'm an advisor to the EDM Council on data ethics, responsible AI, and analytics. I founded an organization called the Information Ethics and Equity Institute, where we come up with training and consulting for organizations who are working toward equitable social outcomes. And I'm also the director of the research lab at UCLA in the Information Studies Department. I've been talking with Danny for a couple of years now as we've been building out material with EDM Council, and we always have these wonderful conversations. So we thought we would share those conversations with the broader membership and get more perspective and insight and help us build out our coverage of this important area.
Thank you. Thanks, Diana. And that's 100% right. As far as these discussions go, we're presenting our perspective on this, and we both have quite a lot of background in this area. Diana is very much focused on the data ethics, and my focus is very much on the AI side. But given how new this area is, I do believe there's still quite a lot for the world to figure out. So I'm hoping that these webinars will be a good basis for sparking discussion and debate about a lot of the topics. And we really would love to hear from you, your questions and comments after this is all done. And perhaps we'll set up a more formal discussion forum on the EDM Council website. As far as my background goes, I'm the Chief AI Officer at Emerge. Technically, I'm an actuary, but I've always told people that I suffer from career ADD, and that wasn't going to last very long with me being just a plain old actuary. So I've been working in the field of AI for now the last 19 years, and I've been very fortunate to be able to lead the EDM Council's AI and Analytics Special Interest Group for the last 2 or so years. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to turn both that interest group as well as the data ethics interest group into areas of much more active and dynamic discussion about a range of different topics, given that the EDM Council's membership includes really some of the leading luminaries in a range of different fields relating to data. So please don't take this as just a webinar. It really is, as far as I see it, the introduction to quite a lot of discussion where you guys can all participate. So turning now to the actual topic of what we want to talk about. The AI has obviously received quite a lot of attention over the last number of years, and for good reason. You can't go to any conference anywhere without somebody saying something about AI. And we're really at the point where AI is starting to show real value to companies. And this is a function both in terms of companies investing in AI, as well as the fact that people are actually getting good at it and showing positive returns on the investments that are made. And by looking at this graph over here, you're already seeing that the value of AI already in 2020, if you add up the various bars, even though this bar is 1.25 trillion, that's only for one of the elements over here. So we're already talking about a value of about $2 trillion being added by AI and its various components to date. And by 2025, it's looking to double that in the next 5 years, which is just an extraordinary rate of return. And one of the reasons that this is so important is that with the explosion of AI, especially with the focus on it generating returns on investment and values, there's an opportunity, first of all, just in terms of the amount of AI that's being used for a lot of ethical pitfalls to be missed, and unfortunately for companies to fall into these traps. Not intentional traps, they just happen to be there. And so it's timely to talk about this just because of the amount of AI that's being deployed and developed at this point in time. Diana, would you like to add anything on this, or happy to go to the next slide?
I think we can go forward one. And
Perfect.
I think one of the main points, and most of you know this intimately, is that technology is not neutral. The way that technology is built and deployed affects outcomes in the real world, and this can perpetuate existing power structures, and it often causes disproportionate harm to underrepresented groups. And so when we're talking about the AI market and all of the potential there, where we're beginning to see use cases and best practices, we're also seeing these flubs as we all move together down the road of AI and learn together. So we're hoping to kind of uncover some of these pitfalls and help increase awareness about the fact that technology isn't neutral and that people need to think carefully when they're making decisions that affect society writ large. Yeah, I think that covers for that slide. This is a slide that I snagged from EDM Councils from John Bottega. It's from the EDM Council's 2020 Global Data Management Benchmark Report. And I've highlighted here that data analytics and data ethics were new topics that were significant functional responsibilities of the chief data executive. So we know that you all are already thinking about these tricky issues, but it's also showing up in the benchmark report, and I suspect the next one will have an even greater role and concentration on AI, the ethical AI responsible deployment of these solutions. So when we see all of these businesses finally generating value off of AI, we have to talk about how to avoid some of these pitfalls or liabilities. And new laws have changed the picture completely. We have GDPR, the UK Data Protection Act. I think I have a slide somewhere of 20 to 30 different pieces of legislation that are either in process or recently put into action in various countries around the world. And I like to bring people back to the Friedman fallacy, in which folks thought that you were only morally obligated to maximize shareholder profit. But what that does is ignore the impact of all of these activities on the public at large. And that's contrary to the foundations of capitalism, because capitalism is tied to the public good. So what that means is that we need to think not just in terms of the shareholder, click, but also the stakeholder. And And I think that that will be in line with the developing policies that are coming out of some of the biggest organizations who are developing AI applications and trying them out in the real world.
Yeah. And as far as that goes, there's a modified version of Friedmanism, which now recognizes that even if one's purely selfishly looking after shareholders, you can't do that without looking after all the other stakeholders too.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're starting to see now is that getting ethics wrong, it actually manifests as an existential threat to businesses. Obviously, depending on how wrong the ethics is gotten, but but certainly there's the risk of complete implosion of businesses to the extent that one gets it wrong. So there's a very big stick. But we're going to be discussing a number of very big advantages when companies really put their heads down and get the ethics right. So even from purely selfish Friedmanism and utilitarian purposes, we're going to see that it's in the interests of businesses really to get their ethics right and to avoid a lot of the shortcomings. The one thing that's interesting is the slide on the right, which I'm going to let Diana talk to, and then I'll jump in after that.
Well, I think it would come as no surprise to most folks on this call that trust is central to the consumer relationship and to long-term viability for your company. And an Edelman puts out a trust barometer every year. And one of their recent studies, they demonstrated that people care more about the ethics of an organization than its competence, which was really shocking to me. But it makes sense to me as well, because I think back about one of the big scandals of my childhood when Tylenol, someone tampered with some Tylenol bottles and killed some people in the US. And rather than try to search by batch number and remove just those bottles that could have been affected, the CEO said, pull all Tylenol products off the shelves until we sort this out. And he did that. And I think Tylenol's reputation today is still grounded in that understanding that that company put patient safety first, consumer safety first, at great detriment to the bottom line, but did the right thing. And sales rebounded when the person was caught and they put the material back out on the shelves, and Tylenol chugged along, having done the right thing. And that was a top-down mandate and a very memorable decision to this. I guess I must have been 9 years old at the time. And I'll never forget that all the Tylenol was off the shelves because the CEO of Tylenol doesn't want anyone else to die. And that's a very powerful thing, and people remember that.
Absolutely. The one depressing slide which we've omitted from today, which I thought I'd mention just while we're on this, is that unfortunately there seems to be a dichotomy of views, and people either believe that you can be competent or ethical, but not both at the moment. There are very few organizations that actually succeed in being seen as both competent and ethical, but we're hoping that with enough attention paid to the idea of ethics by competent people, and enough emphasis on ethics by emphasis on competence by ethical people, enough emphasis on competence, at least ethics by competent people, vice versa, you'll actually find that we end up with organizations in both. So whereas we have Tylenol doing the right thing and being remembered for it, we have therefore profiting in the long term. We actually have the exact opposite in also very memorable circumstances. So this is not so long ago, but you will remember Facebook paying a $5 billion penalty over their privacy breaches relating to Cambridge Analytica in general. And even though $5 billion was really a small proportion of Facebook's net wealth, and net value. Nevertheless, it was more than just a slap on the wrist. And what we're going to be talking about later on is that that was just the regulatory penalty. The actual loss of revenue and the loss and the harm and the wider harm that was suffered by Facebook was much bigger than this $5 billion fine. But it was unprecedented, and this certainly did not do Facebook any favors. Even if I hadn't put this slide on the screen, I'm sure that many of you will have been able just to record this image of Mark Zuckerberg sitting in front of the army of photographers in a very uncomfortable position. So that's what happened over there. And when I talk about the broader ramifications, we have this slide over here, which really puts things into perspective about the loss of trust that happened. So Facebook, Diana, maybe you want to talk to this particular slide.
For sure. This was another Edelman study that was done right at the time of, right after Cambridge Analytica broke. So prior to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the confidence that people felt that Facebook was protecting their privacy was at 79%. And then if you want to advance, Cambridge Analytica broke, it went down to 27% and has hovered there for some time. And that's an extremely large drop, especially when you think about the fact that many communities use Facebook as their primary source of news. And so it really changes the understanding of what's happening in the world when your source of news is no longer trusted. And we've seen a lot of fake news outcomes here in the US. We've seen it with Brexit. We've seen it with numerous political issues. And these things, of course, affect economies.
And in a broader sense, when we talk about that, if good ethics or bad ethics can affect economies, they affect everything within that economy, every single business, and every single participant in that economy. And one of the best examples of this, which is particularly close to home for me, is actually the way poor ethics actually led, and the correct perception of poor ethics actually led to the overthrow of apartheid in South Africa. And it's now been 26 years now, but it was purely, almost exclusively, the economic impact of companies and businesses and governments voting with their feet that actually led to the downfall of apartheid. I remember growing up as a kid during these times and not really understanding what was on the news, but it made a big difference where we had an official exchange rate and then an exchange rate between the US dollar and something called the financial rand, which was just a financial myth or some sophistry to make us feel better that in fact the rand hadn't devalued as much as it actually had. It was an artificially pegged exchange rate. I remember growing up as a kid and distinctly remembering that cars would cost 3 or 4 times as much as houses. And even as a 5 or 6 year old kid, that really didn't make sense to me, because cars lasted for a couple of years, whereas houses were meant to last for much longer. It didn't make sense that you would spend so much more on a car. But all of these massive distortions to the economy, which eventually is what brought down apartheid, was brought about by a country acting not ethically, and other countries and other economies deciding that they weren't prepared to work with the South African economy when it wasn't behaving in a way that was ethical, nowhere near ethical. And that type of change is something to behold. And the type of change that it can bring about is massive. And in fact, actually, it's very interesting. It wasn't just reserved to the government at the time, but actually the current South African government is strongly perceived to be behaving unethically, and they're suffering as a result. not just with their dealings with organizations and economies outside of South Africa, but within South Africa itself. Their unethical behavior is leading them into lots of trouble. And so this is something that, first of all, we see can bring about good overall, but also can damage severely the economies and the finances of companies and countries that are not behaving ethically.
And, this becomes really evident now in the era of smartphone technology where everything's captured on video. So that wasn't the case with apartheid, but people across the world divested from South African businesses and exchange in order to have a real outcome as a result of the lack of ethics. And now we're seeing things every day posted on social media, that's made possible by these platforms. It's been tied to success-ish of the Arab Spring and also to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we were trying to come up with some of the companies that are actively sponsoring and supporting causes that they deem good for society. And the example I like to use is Unilever, which is a consumer products company today, but has a long history, started out as a whaling company. And if you go to Unilever's website today, everything is about their purpose and the ethical long-term effects of their operations on society, on the environment, and on the common good. And here's a quote from, I don't know that it's their mission statement, but it's one of the first quotes on their website, is talking about how they're a purpose-led company and that the values are the foundation of their success. And that is something that rings true in my work with organizations and my talking with folks around the world who are trying to implement AI and other advanced analytics, and really want to make sure that their data decisions are reflecting their values.
And what's amazing about Unilever is just how they had that reversal in direction to move from a whaling company where they used the blubber of whales to make all of their products to now where they completely reverse that, and they really make an effort to state their values and then live by their values. It's really been an effective strategy for them. An example of how a company not only pays lip service to ethics, but actually thrives as a result of it.
And I think that part of this, if we move on now to accountability, values, and trust, if we're seeing successes in the market with companies that are positioning themselves from an ethical standpoint, and trying to be transparent about the connection between those values and the outcomes they're created in the world, it really boils down to what we expect of professionals. Professionals secure a vital public good. You look at a doctor, he or she has taken the Hippocratic Oath. You hold professionals to a standard. And that's what organizations who are launching AI initiatives are trying to learn, what that standard is, and learn how to affect changes that will be beneficial both to the bottom line and to the public. And I can't emphasize more the role of trust in this aspect of professionalism and the relationship with the consumer. And it's also an aspect of professional identity. So internally, your employees, when you have a culture of ethical data management, embrace the higher aspirational message of the organization. And then externally, your consumers know what to expect from you if you act on your values. And these are just some of the issues that come up when we talk about AI situations. You'll have questions about access, consent, and portability. How are the algorithms programmed, and what opportunities are made possible or eliminated by decisions in those algorithms? Do people have the right to erase the information about them? Is there rectification? What happens when you have a breach, or someone wants to change the data that you might have about them? And how do you ensure security when things are changing very quickly and quantum computing is on the horizon? So these are all issues that companies are contending with today. And we don't have answers to all of these. We have some, and it's growing quickly. But these are some of the issues that we'll highlight in these examples.
And there's a real urgency to companies being able to deal with this, because while companies were probably quicker off the mark in figuring out the value and the power of what data can do, we now have a much more aware consumer base where people know that what you can do with their data, and how subject they are to benefit and to harm if that data isn't handled properly. And so people are very much more conscious of this, and very much more opposed to manipulation or the types of harm that come from inappropriate use of their data, and especially in combination and concert with AI. And so we now have a range of capabilities that create new problems as a result of them. Diana, would you like to talk about these?
Oh, sure. These are just highlighting the new capabilities of technology today, and that it's everywhere or ubiquitous. Our databases are often interconnected. Folks moving to the cloud, access is very different. And the fact that things are updated in real time, that kind of dynamism, this creates new problems that we haven't dealt with before and that we don't have legislation to contend with yet. There's a lag between the innovation in technology and then the reins to control that innovation, to make sure that we're meeting the expectations of the public. And some of these problems include re-identification of supposedly anonymized data, complex ownership issues, who has the right to object or the right to access what data. And then, of course, we've got abuse, misuse, and corruption, which we've seen plenty of in recent years. And these are all things that we all want to avoid.
And just to pick up on the one point Diana just made in terms of regulation lag in ethics, I spend my life pretty much involved in AI research, and I am totally drowning in the amounts of new research that comes out on a daily basis. There's no chance at all that I could keep up with the amount of new breakthroughs that are happening at any given point in time. And to expect legislators to be able to keep up with that is just, it will never happen. And so there is a certain amount of responsibility that people who practice in AI need to take on, given that the next big breakthrough is way beyond the ability to be regulated. The one example that springs to mind actually is that in 1943, they asked Pauli, the famous physicist, how long it would be until they came up with a functional nuclear bomb. And even though 2 years later, he presided over the dropping of the first couple, at the time, he said it was going to be another 50 years. And so even for people who are involved in a particular area of study or research, the rate at which breakthroughs happen even boggle their minds and defy their estimates as to how fast these things are going to happen. And so I don't even think, so certainly I'm not even sure the practitioners are able to keep up with the ethical concerns relating to their field of practice. But certainly, if anybody's going to have a chance to do it, it's them, and it's not going to be regulation, which is why self-regulation and the responsibility that comes with the knowledge of what people are doing in a particular field, that particular responsibility is absolutely important to protect ourselves and the public from egregious misuse and abuse of these new technologies.
So just to summarize, this implies that there's a moral obligation of organizations to contribute not only to their shareholder outcomes, but to the betterment of society. And that's being codified through legislation. But since there's this gap, it's a real opportunity for organizations and trade organizations to lead in helping to shape the best practices in ways that are beneficial to everyone. And in my classes, I teach that there are sort of three elements of harm, or three categories of harms that we can divide these things into: diminished privacy and security, barriers to transparency and autonomy, and inequitable outcomes. We have some examples of those. I guess,
Yes,
do you want to,
yeah,
let's do the next slide, yeah.
And part of this has to do with, by the way, I've noticed that some people are posting questions. I will try answer them on the fly, but if not, we are going to be reserving some time at the end to deal with questions and answers. So if we don't cover it at the moment, please don't worry. We will try address the questions at the end if we don't manage to do it in the middle. But the one thing that is clear is that even with the best intent and with people taking steps to act in an ethical way, the area of machine learning is so technically complex that even in less technically complex areas, it's inevitable that humans will make mistakes. And so I don't think companies should beat themselves up if this type of thing happens. It's expected for that to happen, and I think it's also the public should expect these types of things to happen. But what creates trust and what allows companies to behave in a professional way is not the avoidance of mistakes, and certainly companies are going to be taking every step they can to avoid the mistakes. But given the inevitability of it, what marks a professional and what marks an organization that is trustworthy is how they respond to those mistakes. And so the question is, when a company makes a mistake which harms people, do they take ownership for it? Do they own up for it? Do they let people who are vulnerable know that they're vulnerable because of the mistakes of the company as soon as possible? Or do they lawyer up and try to protect themselves and deny and sidestep and do everything they can to avoid taking responsibility? They might win, by the way, doing that from a legal point of view in the short term, but this is not the type of thing that people forget. So what we're talking about over here on the screen at the moment is we're looking at the number of
these are the data breaches. Yeah, these are data breaches from 2019. And you can see that the curve is very, very steep, and it's inevitable that people are going to make these mistakes. But the response, like Danny was saying, is a reflection of the organization's values. In 2019, there were 8.5 billion breached records. That's billion with a B. And incidentally, 86% of these were the result of server misconfiguration. So there's clearly room in there to ameliorate that kind of situation, but the effects can be really damaging. If you want to go to the next slide, lost business following a data breach was the greatest component of losses. In a recent survey, I believe this was the IBM survey.
Yes.
The average cost of a data breach in the US financial sector is 14 million. The average cost of a data breach overall was 1.42 million, but lost business makes up the greatest component of that. And so if you want to cut down on the loss of that business, you want to preserve consumer trust. And the best way to do that is to be transparent about your values and how that affects your decision-making.
Yeah, one of the best examples I could see of people not doing this was the Equifax breach 2 or 3 years ago. This was probably the most consequential breach in US history, in that the financial records of 140 million Americans and Canadians was breached. They're not sure who did it, though they have their suspicions. And it took them 76 days to actually pick up the breach, during which time the hackers had unfettered access to the Equifax servers. This is a credit bureau, so incredibly sensitive information. And that was also a server misconfiguration. Actually, they failed to install the security update, even though they'd been warned to install the security update. But what was, for me, most shocking about this was from the time that they found out about it until the time that they actually announced it to the public was 39 days later. So you basically had, if you combine that with the 76 days that the hackers had before it was discovered, and then the 39 days that Equifax kept the news to themselves, the people were exposed to 115 days of people having access to their financial information without them being able to protect themselves. This was horrendous, and particularly in the case of credit bureaus, where people don't have the opportunity in many cases to erase their information. It's out there whether you want it or not. And it's also not particularly easy to rectify information. The fact that this was now available to hackers for such a long time, and people were going around unprotected for so long, that was a real problem. And I think Equifax has suffered substantially ever since.
So everyone wants solutions. And we thought we'd talk about 4 areas to focus on when you're thinking about solutions to these trust risks in AI deployment. And we'd like to talk briefly about diversity, materiality, transparency, and purpose.
And I should mention that these are just a handful, and this is by no means the comprehensive list of solutions to the AI ethical problems, but these certainly go a long way to addressing some of the most common mistakes and common pitfalls.
Did you want to talk about, for example?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. So one of the things that people make a mistake on is the problem when you're developing machine learning algorithms is that it's very theoretical. As somebody who does this, you sit in front of a computer and you've got databases and you're writing code and you're checking how well your predictions fit the data, and it's great. But one of the things that gets missed out is that, as we'll talk about just now, is that there are real world consequences. And in many cases, while the machine might be working accurately, you might end up with some very unintended consequences. And this is often as a function of, again, even people trying to act ethically can make the mistake of not realizing the power of machine learning's ability to recognize patterns. And this is a function of certain variables being proxies for others. So again, bringing up the South African example, so obviously, South Africa is particularly sensitive to racism and discrimination of all types. And it's entirely illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. But there was actually a case of a South African bank which got resolved about 18 months ago. It was actually the biggest bank in South Africa, First National Bank. And what they got sued for was the fact that their algorithms were discriminating against Black applicants for mortgages at more than 3 times the rate of non-Black applicants. And the Black applicants, when they actually got mortgages approved, were invariably, but on average, given a substantially higher interest rate to repay than non-Black applicants. And so they were sued in the High Court. And it's not that FNB set out to discriminate on the basis of race. They certainly wouldn't have done such a thing. But what they forgot was that actually included in their credit scorecard was income. And the interesting thing is that in South Africa, income is a very good proxy for race, given the historical disparities between income between various racial groups. And so using income which makes perfect sense for a credit scorecard, almost allow them to discriminate almost perfectly against different racial groups. Now, it's actually interesting that as it turns out, First National Bank actually won the case because it was considered to be reasonable to use income, even though it resulted in this outcome. But to be honest, this is something that FNB has come up with. They've realized that it might be strictly speaking correct legally, and they didn't have to pay huge amounts of damages. But they certainly didn't want this outcome. They didn't want to alienate and prejudice a significant proportion of the South African community. It's the majority of the South African population. And so they, in spite of winning the case, have taken significant measures in order to try ameliorate the effect of the pure clinical distinction of the algorithm. And there are many, many examples where using the data, just the data that we have, has resulted in tremendously unfair discrimination. There's the famous case of Amazon's hiring algorithm discriminating very strongly against females, which is also a problem. The point that I'm making over here is not that this discrimination might be something that is illegal, but it might be something that you don't necessarily want to do, but it's something that you need to discuss. Whether you do or do want to do it as a company is something that you need to discuss. And it's very interesting. As an actuary, we have numerous examples of this. For example, as it turns out, males have higher mortality rates than females, whereas females tend to have higher sickness rates than males. So from a purely statistical point of view, it makes sense to charge men more for life insurance, but women more for health insurance. And in fact, that is the case in many parts of the world where they do that. But in certain, they've considered this statistics and they've done that. But there's certain areas where they've decided that they're not comfortable with that, but they've had the discussion. So, for example, in the EU, it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex, and as a result of that, you cannot charge males more for life insurance and females more for health insurance. That's a decision that they took, but they did that with their eyes open and consciously decided that that's where they as a society wanted to be. And so some of the ways that you can actually avoid these types of problems are, first of all, it's diversity in two main ways. One is making sure that your data set is diverse enough. Do you actually have sufficient representation of the population that you're trying to service in your data? And if you don't, you'll end up with a grossly unrepresentative algorithm. And sometimes actually you want that, by the way, as the Microsoft Tay bot demonstrated previously. They modeled their chatbot on the average person on Twitter, and as it turns out, the average person on Twitter was quite racist. And so in that case, that was an example where they wanted perhaps a bit less diversity. But the point that I was making is that you want to make sure that the data that you're using is representative of how you would like the outcome to be. And it's got to include that. And you also need diversity in terms of the algorithmic builders, because these are people who will pick up on these types of really undesirable outcomes, and they'll have them front of mind while they're building these algorithms, which might be missed by other people who don't share those vulnerabilities. Diana, would you like to add to that, or should I go to the next?
Well, I would say that the diversity in the people participating in the decision-making process as you're building out AI, machine learning, and analytics solutions is very important, because there are going to be things that you would never, it would not occur to you because it is not on your radar, whereas someone from a different background may be very well attuned to the potential outcomes, potential negative externalities resulting from a certain decision. I think we can go through the next few pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Materiality is a huge concept in my mind, because everything seems to be done on the phone or on the laptop without regard for real outcomes in the physical world. And this image here was an artist's attempt to materialize the deaths of COVID-19 in the United States, because numbers, once you get a large number, it's very hard to wrap your brain around it as an individual just reading the news. And so understanding the materiality of data decisions is a key solution to preventing that risk or minimizing the risk of having these negative outcomes on society. We can go to the next.
It was Joseph Stalin who said, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic," and that's what you're seeing over here. That First National Bank example might have just been seen as a different approval rate or decline rate or different average interest rate, but in real terms, it meant people not getting a roof over their heads, which is something that is missed in front of the keyboard and screen. So translating it into and being mindful of the real world outcomes and consequences of these algorithms does help one focus the mind a bit more when building these things.
And then when we talk about transparency, there have been studies that show that being more transparent actually benefits the consumer trust relationship. I think this study talks about doctors admitting their mistakes to their patients and correlating that with the rate of lawsuits, malpractice suits. And it turns out that transparency translates to authenticity. If you're not hiding how you're making your calculations, your decisions, people tend to have more trust that your decision-making is aligned with your values. And if human error is inevitable, consumers can at least trust that the company is going to act according to its values, and transparency reinforces this.
And it wasn't even a subtle difference. The study at University of Michigan found a 65% decline in lawsuits when doctors owned up to every mistake that they made, as opposed to covering it up. And so too, when we talk about in the financial or non-medical areas, when people see you as human, they're much more likely to empathize with the difficult task that you have at hand in dealing with so many customers and clients and trying to get it right. As long as they can see you trying to get it right and being transparent, they're much more likely to sympathize and empathize with you as a company than they would if you're a faceless, lawyered up institution.
One of the things that I've heard the most in the past 3 years, talking to folks about ethics in data management, has been the role of purpose. And this is just a quick example of the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. They were not the only people to invent airplanes or to fly them successfully. But as Simon Sinek points out, the difference was that Orville and Wilbur were driven by a cause, by a purpose, by a belief. And that's attractive to consumers. It engenders consumer loyalty and community and ties into ESG goals very well.
And I should mention over here that this doesn't only relate to getting customers, but it also relates to the attraction and retention of quality staff members. So the harm that comes from acting unethically and in a way that is disconsonant with one's purpose means that you don't only lose customers, but you don't attract the right type of employee to your business. People who are motivated and willing to go the extra mile for the business. And one of the places where we see this happening exceptionally well, and actually happens to be one of the questions that was asked, is with regards to social media. And I'd like to put over here Facebook's mission and WhatsApp's mission. And Facebook's mission is to give people the power to build communities and bring the world closer together. And WhatsApp says, there's a little bit before which talks about their history in replacing SMS, but they say some of your most personal moments are shared with WhatsApp, which is why we built end-to-end encryption in our app. And there's a desire to let people communicate anywhere in the world without barriers. In light of recent events, this is the type of thing that might be met with some measure of skepticism. And in fact, the kind of aborted attempt to and the ultimatum to force WhatsApp users to share their data with Facebook, is indicative of the fact that this really wasn't well accepted, and it translated. People didn't believe this anymore, and it translated into a loss of users. For several weeks, WhatsApp's competitors, Telegram and Signal, were the top downloaded apps in the app stores of both Google and Apple. And more than that, that's just the loss of customers. If you follow the trajectory of workplace surveys and where it's nice to work, you'll find that whereas up until about 2016 and 17, Facebook and Google were almost invariably within the top 5 employers to work for, that is no longer the case. It's not perceived to be that way, despite the fact that they provide amazing work conditions and amazing benefits. They're no longer perceived to be the gold standard of what a workplace employer should be like. And so I think we're going to wrap up over here with just one or two conclusions. But the point is that the harm is much more than just your customers. It's harm to the very fabric of one's business. So I just want to thank you again. This is, again, I stress, not by any means a comprehensive discussion of the topic, but really just something to start the discussion. And I'm really very happy that and grateful that you joined us today. We're going to try and answer the questions that were posted on the screen. But if we don't get to them, please do write to us. Our details will be shared by the EDM Council. If not, you can just track us on EDM Connect. But those are our details on the screen. And let's see if we can start working through some of those questions. There's one that I'm going to start off with just because I by mistake deleted it. So I don't want to forget it. But the one question that came up was, if you don't have enough diversity in your data, can you create it? And if so, how and should you? So the question is if you're aware of that lack of diversity, is it going to be something that will result in an outcome that you don't want? So it doesn't matter if I, for example, don't have any Brazilians in my database if my company will not do any business with Brazil. It's a type of diversity. In that case, that's not necessary if I'm operating in a completely different market. But if I'm operating in a market and I'm trying to work within the entire market and my data set doesn't represent that entire market, so I'm only inevitably either going to be catering to a small portion of the market, or I'm inevitably going to be discriminating in one way or another, rightly or wrongly. In many cases, by the way, it's you might discriminate in the wrong direction. You might say underprice a product because you don't have enough information about a particular segment of the population that you're trying to serve. And if that's the case, I think in those cases it would be advisable to enrich your data and get some diversity. There are ways to do that. One way is there are a few statistical methods where you can give undue focus on the little bit of representation that you have to scale it up as if you have more of that type of population group in your data set. Alternatively, there are ways to actually buy data and I'm not talking about unscrupulous data buying, but buying data from data sets that have been curated and collected for people who volunteer their data precisely to avoid this type of problem. So there are such data sets which allow people to enrich their data sets to create the right amount of representation. So I hope that answers that question.
I think there's another part of that is if you have a data set that is not appropriately representative for the task at hand, even acknowledging that the data set is not representative is a huge step that companies haven't necessarily done before. And then having those discussions with your team, what does the lack of representation in this data set imply about the social context? And how might our decisions affect that social context is leaps and bounds ahead of where most organizations are operating right now. So whether you decide to enrich your data or to run focus groups or take other actions to try to figure out that missing component, having those conversations is instrumental to cultivating this culture of ethical data management for AI deployment. I see something here about price differentiation. at individual levels with respect to proxy variables. And yes, it's true. It does become difficult to differentiate in price based on gender, sex, race, and depending on the code of ethics of your organization, that might be a good thing. If you want to differentiate based on proxy variables that you think could be a flashpoint, be transparent about it and why you're doing it. And if your values, if you're true to your values, your customers will come along with you. If it is counter to their expectation for how your company does business, that's when business is going to be lost.
And I see there's another question. Do you foresee a black swan type event driving the rapid introduction of ethical AI regulations similar to the 2008 crash, or the more gradual increase of legislation in response to shifts in consumer sentiments and smaller negative events? So given that my personal view is that I think there's going to be, I do think there'll be one of, perhaps even more than one black swan event, just given the unprecedented rate at which research is happening. And I don't necessarily think individual researchers are aware of the breakthroughs that are around the corner. And also, in many cases, I don't think researchers are fully aware of the ramifications of some of the algorithms that they're deploying and what they could actually end up doing. So I'm not talking about hitting singularities where all of a sudden AI gets out of control, but I am talking about individual researchers or individual teams actually making a breakthrough which they don't fully understand and which is used before they come to terms with it. So I think there'll definitely be a lot of the smaller ones, but I'm also anticipating one or two egregious situations that actually bring these types of things to the fore. I think actually the Facebook Cambridge Analytica one was a similar type of incident like that. So I'm not necessarily talking about cataclysmic economic meltdown, but I certainly think that a few really big scandals like that are likely to happen over time.
I see Errol's comment about socially responsible investing and whether ethics in AI deployment should be one of the criteria in a sustainability program. I agree completely. I think that AI, machine learning, data analytics, all of these things should be done in accordance with the ethical principles of the organizational culture. And so the key is to evolve your organization's culture so that everyone from the top to the bottom is aligned on what the organization's identity is, who we are, what we're trying to do in the world, and how we do it. And the more transparent you make it, the more material you consider it, and the more diverse perspectives you have going into your conversations, that will translate to authenticity. And so I do think that that should be a criterion in a sustainability program.
Perfect. Thank you, Diana. I'm afraid we're over time, so we're going to have to wrap up there. Thank you very much again for being with us today. And please, if we didn't get to your questions, please do be in contact with either Diana or me, and we'd be very happy to respond to those questions. Look forward to seeing you in more of these webinars in the future. And thanks very much to Yolan and Mark and Carol for setting this up and for putting up with my technical incompetence. So have a great day, everyone, and I hope you really, I really hope you benefited from our discussion today. Take care.
Thank you so much.